Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the special meeting of the Housing and Community Safety Policy and Scrutiny Committee. Special in that we're joined by members of Economy in Place, Scrutiny, so welcome to Councillor Taylor and your happy band of EMP members. And welcome to members of the public and officers who are with us this evening, and those people watching at home. I'll start the meeting with any declarations of interest. Do any members? Councillor Pavlovic.
It's not a prejudicial interest, Chair, but I am on staff of Rachel Maskell and she has got a private member's bill relating to this topic.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else? No? Thank you. The minutes of our last meeting, which was held on the 19th of, it says here 19th of April, I think it was 19th of July. Yeah, that's fine. Minutes of the meeting on the 19th of July. Do any members have any comments on the accuracy of those minutes? Councillor Pavlovic.
Just on page 3, second to bottom paragraph, it said cold homes were confirmed to exasperate a great many health. I think it's exacerbate.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you for that. There was an action arising for Ian Cunningham to provide us with some more granular data on hate crime and violent crime, which he did separately after the meeting to the Vice Chair and I. So if I can ask that the text of Ian's response is appended to the minutes, if that's okay. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much. I shall just sign the minutes. Thank you, Robert. Okay, agenda item 3, public participation. Before I invite our public speaker to join us, I'm going to flip agenda items 4 and 5 so we can take the discussion on the government consultation on short-term holiday lets before the Q1 finance and performance monitor. Because the officer who will need to submit the response to the government consultation has to do it this evening. So it's important that we give ample time for that discussion, and then we'll take the Q1 monitor. Economy in Place members are welcome to stay for that item, or you can leave. It's up to you. Okay, so move on to public participation. We've got one member of the public registered to speak this evening, who's very welcome. Mari McMahon, would you like to come and join us at the table, Mari? So in front of you on this little black box, the mic button is just in the center. If you press that, it should turn green. Great. Okay. You've got 3 minutes to speak to us, so in your own time.
Okay, I'm French and I worked for Government in Paris, and I was author of the project to control and restrict holiday lets. And the enforcement process in England I find rather difficult by comparison with that in France. We have 6-year permits for people. Investors can buy compensation in social housing, care homes and student housing. They have indeterminate contracts. Second, for primary homeowners who want to rent out their flats, they can do it for 120 days a year. They all need permits, change of use. It's a very simplified process. And one police complaint and it's over. And my experience here in dealing with it is that the enforcement process requires a lot of detail, as I say, snapshots, photographs, recordings, diaries, statements. It's been a bit overwhelming, and I've been looking at enforcement cases, because you have case law in enforcement cases, and I've been looking quite a lot of appeal decisions. And I've seen that in Cambridge, they're enforcing holiday lets without complaints, flats of 2, on the basis of the local plan only, without complaints, critical shortage of housing. At the moment, they're dealing with 76 cases, some of them in multiples. And one particular case in Oxford I looked at, there's a house of 4 for 4 people in a cul-de-sac that was enforced on loss of amenity plus the local plan, which said LP policy H5 relates to development involving loss of dwellings, blah, blah, blah. And I noted that the York 2005 plan had the same clause in it. Brighton has the same clause. It's been removed. That clause has been removed. I wanted to talk about that, but since looking at all that, I've been looking at the Edinburgh licensing scheme, which is a work of remarkable beauty. It's very complete. And the interesting point here is that you need a license, which is 3-year renewable. And each time you renew, it has to be publicized. So this gives neighbors the chance to have their say. And they've also referred to the Town and Country Planning Act of 1990, 2D, which stipulates that if there's a change of use, you need planning permission. And it's going through the committee meetings of Scotland. I've seen that they don't put any figures on it. It's just the transient nature of it means that they all, from a 1-person studio to a 20-person house, all need planning permission. It's also the most complete document I've seen, in as much as it looks at things like you need a commercial, if you have a mortgage, you need a commercial mortgage, which is much more expensive. And you need, they also look at the deeds, because some deeds don't allow, for example, my bungalow built in the 1990s will not allow commercial letting. So it's the most complete document I've seen.
Thank you very much. There was a lot of interesting information there, which it would be great to have more time to go into it in more depth. However, I will give members the opportunity to ask any questions about any of the specifics you raised. You mentioned examples in Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, and France, and that was an interesting comparison. So I'll just give members the opportunity for a few minutes to come back and ask any questions they may have on some of the examples that you raised. Councillor Kilbane.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for that contribution. Did you say, I'm not sure if I heard you right, did you say that in the York local plan, there used to be a clause that we could use to control the amount of holiday lets, but that's now gone from the local plan?
It's in the local plan. It doesn't refer to holiday lets specifically. It says the LP policy H5 relates to development involving loss of dwellings, and it states, amongst other things, that planning permission will not be granted for any development that relates in the net loss of 1 or more self-contained dwellings on a site, except where it meets one of a number of circumstances. So Brighton has the same, exactly the same. York had exactly the same in 2005. It's been removed. It's been replaced by something more interesting. It's page 91. This is the 2018 version. Section 5, blah, 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 blah. It is preferential to keep people living where they need to be as far as possible, because this relates in a way to the meeting we had with Councillor Crankhill about the difficulties in the groves, as we're very strategically placed with Nestle, the hospital, university, schools, that HMOs and families are being chased out. This point is perhaps quite pertinent to that. And that in one of the material considerations in making a planning decision is the local plan or the emerging plan. But I've written to John Snow about this when I picked it up. I wrote to John Snow and told him that it's been removed. And he's only just replied to me because they've been very busy with the 4th thingamajig. They've been in meetings. So I picked up on that.
Thank you for that. Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Would you like to outline why in particular this is of interest to you in the York context, in the nature of the environments and community that you live in?
Simply because I live on Grove Terrace Lane and we have 3 conjoined holiday lets in the cul-de-sac in Emerald Street. And they were causing a lot of trouble. And I knew the neighbours, it started in 2016. And to pacify or to try and calm it down, the owner of 2 of the houses directed his guests up and down Grove Terrace Lane. So we were getting drunks and all sorts of awful people. So I went to see them to say that I think you can do something about it. There's no way I'm going to get involved with York City Council. That's what I said, those are my words, but the people most affected are single parents working full-time or people without internet connections. So I ended up getting involved. And Carrie Coltart on Park Grove has now got one in front of her. And because everybody in the Groves is moaning about it. And it's not only, we hear about party houses, but it's not only party houses, it's more insidious than that. In these narrow Victorian streets, they're very reverberant. And even the houses of 5 or 6 people, they're mainly young people coming here. They're going out to enjoy themselves. They want to have fun. They're coming back even just after maybe 2 or 3 drinks there. You behave differently. They're on holiday. And what you hear, or what you're hearing from people all in the Groves, for particularly Park Crescent, there are 5 in Park Crescent, they're being woken up constantly. And the problem, Carrie, I know Carrie very well, and she's opposite one, and her husband's very, very laid back, but he's a professor at Sheffield University, he has to get up at 6 o'clock. And he started getting irate about it because it's 2 o'clock, it's 3 o'clock, 4, it doesn't have to be a party house, but it's this late night coming and going. And they come back home with the windows open and they're talking and laughing. And people are being woken up all the time. So it's the talk of the town in the Groves at the moment.
Thank you.
So it's not only party houses.
Yes, yeah. Thank you for that. Councillor Talbot.
Thank you, Marie. And it was an incredibly interesting discussion that you've just started. It's a shame we don't have more time, given your obvious expertise in this area. But we're constantly told that, unlike Scotland, which is legislating, and you've seen the Edinburgh, the legislation that they've brought into Edinburgh. Have you explored what could be done on a local level, for example? Do you think England has the powers as it is outside of London, because London has its own powers? What could be done now without waiting for primary legislation?
It's a question of financing, I think, because it's a question of having officers to deal with it. And from my understanding, they're dealing with the party houses from the big complaints. They don't have enough staff. Now, I've been through the Edinburgh case. So you need a license. It's the most refined license I've seen, but you also need planning permission. And in the majority of cases, it's a question of not supply and demand. What's the word? It's for example, in Edinburgh, you have different kinds of licenses. People and they're giving short licenses for the 6-week period of the Edinburgh Festival, where they need the license because they've got to prove that everything is fireproof. They do not need planning permission. When it's constant, they need planning. They all need planning permission. And the at the moment, well, we don't know, because Rachel Maskell's bill will have its 2nd reading in December, I think. Then it has to go to House of Lords, and then get royal assent, and then come. And York will, I think, each local authority will be able to make their own decisions. But I think, and I'm reading now that Edinburgh is completely inundated. They don't have the officers. They've gone crazy. And we had in France a simplified system of just filling out some forms. It was a change of use and getting a registration at the same time. It initially took 6 months. It's now 1 month. But you need a 13 letter number thing that goes on the portals. They found that people were cheating. They were inventing the numbers. So they started initiating fines of 50,000 euros. The fine has gone up to 80,000 euros and 1 year imprisonment for false declarations. And there have been a lot of fines. They've been able to employ more people. But that's at a national level. So I don't know what York could do now. What means they have to deal with this problem.
I mean, one of the questions in one of the questions in this consultation is what evidence is there from overseas?
Well,
One of the questions is what is the evidence from overseas?
from France.
So France, you've already mentioned, and we know about Barcelona, and we know about various other. But from your experience, and I know that you're living in York now, but did bringing in restrictions and licenses, has that made any difference to the numbers?
It has made a difference because they're limited to 6 years.
Yeah.
But you also have freehold and leasehold agreements. And in point of fact, because I've been working on it, I live in Nice now on a contractual basis with the French government. And in point of fact, so transpires that most condominiums, it's not allowed. So it's all being screwed up. In the countryside, it's easier. I won't go into those details. It's a commercial activity, and you have, no,
that's really interesting to hear your perspective, and that's the whole point of scrutiny is to hear the voices of the people that we represent. So it's really helpful, and some of the issues you raised, I'm sure we'll pick up with officers when we come to the main body of discussion. But thank you very much for joining us. Please feel free to stay for the rest of the meeting. You're more than welcome.
thank you.
And thank you for your input. Thank you. So if we now move on to item 5, which will take before item 4, I can invite officers to join us at the table, and I will invite them to introduce themselves. I suppose just to sort of say at the outset, what I'd like to focus on here is the material that it is proposed is submitted to government from this authority, and anything we would want to add to it, anything we'd want to change in it. So we could spend a long time discussing each of the questions posed in this consultation. And I'm sure this is an issue if the government launches a further consultation on proposed policy changes later in the year, as they've indicated they will do. There will be another opportunity for our respective committees to have another discussion, but conscious that an officer will need to go away and try and reflect our discussion and any specific points we want to see reflected in the council's response later this evening, because the deadline is midnight. If we can try and keep our discussion focused on these responses and what we would like to change, if anything, I think that would be, hopefully officers will appreciate if we can try and give them a chance of understanding and responding to what we say. So if I can ask Tracy, Becky and Michael you can introduce yourselves, please.
Certainly. Tracy Carter, Director of Economy, Generation and Housing.
Becky Eads, Head of Planning and Development Services.
And Michael Jones, Head of Housing Delivery and Asset Management.
And
Thank
can
you
very
very
briefly introduce the paper before handing over to Michael to talk specifically about the questions. So the issue of holiday lets is becoming increasingly a national issue, and I think that's as a consequence of that. What we've got here in front of us is a call for evidence from government on the impact of holiday lets on the housing market and on communities, a call for evidence so that will inform the development of a potential white paper, which, as you say, would then subsequently lead to a further consultation before it would come into statute. But I think you can see from the nature of some of the questions that there's perhaps a lack of understanding in government about the impact that this subject has upon communities and upon the housing market. Questions around, how many are there when you've got no possible way of knowing how many there are because they're not registered. Questions around, is enforcement successful when there's no comprehensive regime for enforcement in England, which differs from other parts of the union. Or perhaps exemplify that they don't quite get what's going on out there. So what we've got here is a series of responses to questions where we want to be fairly concise with our evidential approach to it, but without missing the impact which we see, which is it's not one-sided. There is a potential positive impact of holiday lets upon our tourism industries, and we shouldn't leave that to one side. But the extent to which it is becoming an issue for communities, and the extent to which it's impacting on housing and supply, is a balance to be struck. And Becky's come along today to answer any questions about how the current planning regime deals with this issue, and when it requires planning permission, when it doesn't, and what any changes to statute might lead to. And Michael can answer questions about the evidence base that we've got to reflect the extent of holiday homes in the city and the impact that we can see it having on housing supply on communities. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, as Tracy said, the evidence that we've pulled together here is pieced together to some extent. You know, it's not, a lot of this isn't publicly available because of the lack of regulation and the way it currently works. So we've attempted with our best endeavours to pull together an evidence base to inform this conversation. So we've called upon colleagues in economy, planning, housing and public protection, but there are some gaps. So, for example, the way that public protection record noise incidents, for example, is they don't necessarily record it as a noise incident related to a short-term holiday let. They record it as a noise incident on a premises. So there may be some underreporting here, but we've tried to put it together as evidence the best we can. As Tracy said, at the moment, it's a highly unregulated sector. So the questions about how effective enforcement at the moment is very difficult one to answer because there isn't really that much to enforce against. I won't go through each question, but I guess just for context, the headlines are that in York, we believe there's been a fairly significant growth in short-term holiday lets over the last 5 years. So based on the best information we have, it's gone from 937 in 2018 up to 2,055 now. And that growth is more significant when you look at the entire home being let. So we think that's kind of trebled in the last 4 years. It still represents a relatively low proportion of the housing stock in York. So about 2.18% of privately owned properties are short-term holiday lets. But that is much more stronger close to the city centre. So as you would expect, a real concentration in the city centre and the wards around it, where that percentage is much higher than 2%. And obviously the wards further away from the city centre are less affected. I think that's all I'd like to say really by way of an introduction. Very happy to talk about specific questions if that would be helpful, but it's probably enough context to get going.
Thank you, Michael. So the first question is, and this is where a lot of this I found really interesting and in some ways quite worrying. Information comes out in terms of the scale of the issue, and fully appreciate that, you know, we're kind of having to make a best guess a lot of the time because of the lack of regulation that doesn't deliver the kind of robust data that would otherwise be available. But I think it sets it out really quite clearly. Because the question that is asked at this point is, provide us with evidence illustrating the size and nature of the short-term letting market and how this has changed. So I suppose the question for members is, from reading that kind of overview of the situation, is there anything that members feel is missing or not drawn out, perhaps in a way that we would want it to, in order to get the message we want to get across to government? Councillor Pavlovic.
Thank you, and thank you for the report and all the data within it. One area that I did wonder whether we could have incorporated something about was the impact on the local housing market, to slightly more extent than is currently in there. And I'm just wondering, one, did you consult with housing colleagues about the number of people from private rented sector that were on long-term lets who've been evicted by landlords who are flipping their properties to convert them into short-term lets? We've seen, I've certainly seen evidence of a number of increased Section 21 no-fault eviction notices of people who've then registered with housing as homeless because they can't actually find somewhere else to rent. I do have a subsequent question, but did you do any work with housing colleagues in resettlement, housing options?
The questions and the draft responses were shared with Ruth and Den. So I guess Ruth covers the private rented sector stuff. And I think that's represented in here in a later question where we talk about kind of anecdotal information that there are a number of landlords that are following the financial benefits that sometimes come with a short-term holiday let, and there's a transition from private rented into holiday lets. But we don't necessarily record that because what happens to a property after it stops being private rented, licensed HMO is not necessarily recorded. So whether it returns to a residential dwelling or whether it goes to a short-term holiday let, we wouldn't necessarily have that information. I don't think that we've recorded the number of people that have been kicked out of private rented accommodation and then that accommodation's turned into short-term holiday lets. I don't think we have that.
Now, the other circumstantial evidence element to that particular scenario is that some people taking their private rented houses off the market and disposing of them due to changes in the tax regime around being a landlord. So it's quite a murky picture and we weren't able to give an evidence base on that one.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up. The legislation that takes away the tax perks, if you like, that used to exist for long-term landlords don't exist for short-term landlords and for holiday lets. And certainly we've seen evidence of landlords complaining that that there's a disincentive for them to retain their long-term lets, and they just say, you know, I've got a portfolio of 5 properties, I'm going to flip them all to short-term lets, and something needs to be done about that. I mean, there's two arguments. One, you can replace the tax incentives, or alternatively, you can take away the advantages for the short-term lets, and that I think would be preferable. But one other bit of data that I did wonder whether it might be worth incorporating within this is the actual impact on the private sector, private rented sector. We know that rents in York are incredibly expensive anyway, but in comparison, and I'm just looking at an article in Property Investor today, Airbnb experts reveal best UK cities to be a host this August. And basically what they're saying is that in York, for an entire property, you're looking at £2,200 a month, which is obviously more than we're looking at for the average property in the long-term letting market. So there's, again, further incentives to flip your property. And what we're seeing at the moment, you know, we've seen the rise that you've absolutely outlined, but I do wonder whether contextualizing it for the York's situation, we're already paying through the nose for rents, but the more properties that we lose, the harder that's going to be and the higher rents are going to be in the long-term letting. So I just wonder whether you can incorporate something around around that, albeit you've only got 2 hours, two or 3 hours to do it in.
I think it's- I'm gonna commit you to doing something now, so this might be, you might wish you could cross me. We won't be able to get an evidence base on the increase in no fault evictions and then the argument about how that flows through, but we can do the kind of circumstantial evidence around the increase and how the interplay between the reduction in tax incentives for long-term lets and that flip into short-term lets, because it's the same tax status and an increased revenue. We can definitely make that point, but I don't think we'll have a particularly strong numerical evidence base for it.
Yeah, agreed on that. I guess the bit that I was just going to say is in paragraph 32, question 6. It does talk about market analysis, highlighting there are significantly greater returns available for landlords in renting out short-term holiday lets compared to longer-term rental, and how that, if unchecked, could have a significant impact on the housing market in York. So I could potentially embellish that bit with the tax incentives information that you provided. That would be helpful.
Yep. No, thank you for that. Right, I've got a few hands to go through. Councillor Kilbane.
I thought Councillor Taylor was in front of me, but always happy to jump in front. And it is relevant actually to the point that Councillor Pavlovic was just making. I was going to make it under section 6, but it might be worth thinking about whether or not you've got time to include. So I just did a quick Google on Rightmove, and there is a house for sale in Bishop Hill in the city centre, a 2-up, 2-down terraced house that's on the market for £350,000 today. After you've paid your £35,000 deposit, your mortgage payments are going to be £1,500 a month. To get that mortgage, you've got to be earning £80,000 a year. So you could work out what percentile of people in York earn £80,000 a year, and then you'd know how many people in York could actually afford to buy that house. Interestingly, the 2,200 figure that you're going to get your returns according to the property investors would cover your £1,500 mortgage. So clearly, a 2-up, 2-down terraced house, walk in off the street through the door into the living room, bit of a backyard, and that's it. If you're earning £80,000 a year, it's unlikely that you're going to buy that to live in. It's only going to be sold on the market as a holiday let. So that's where the market has gone. And if the market continues to be unregulated, then communities like Bishop Hill in the city centre, communities in Guildhall will be hollowed out. And they are currently being hollowed out. So I know that of the last 3 houses that sold on a street in Bishop Hill, they were all sold for holiday lets. And that's because that's the only viable option for them at that price, unless you're a very rich person that wants to live in a small terraced house. So I don't know if you've got time in the couple of hours you've got, but it's I'm not going to say where it is because I'm not going to advertise it, but no, you'll find them for sale online now, and they're the kind of prices they're going for.
I'll go and get a few more contributions and then come back to officers for any response. Councillor Taylor.
Thanks, Chair. Got 2 questions, if I may. First one's a sort of soft point, and it might not make any material difference whatsoever to how our submission's received. But I think once or twice in the sort of draft submission, there's a reference to how the overall percentage of dwellings is quite low in terms of the city's overall private rented stock. So just over 2%. Now, maybe it's just because I'm a bit warped, but I read that and I thought, well, 2%, that's still quite a lot. If you think about it in terms of the amount of people that are on the housing waiting list or not in suitable accommodation, and on a citywide level, even though they are very much concentrated in Guildhall and Micklegate, I think that's still quite a high number on that sort of population-wide perspective. And I guess my ask was, do you think we could, I don't know, delete any references in this to that percentage being low, even though we do say it's still higher than other places in the UK? I mean, it's a very soft point, but I think there's a danger of maybe minimizing things unintentionally. But
yeah, I mean, I think we don't, we don't want to somehow seek to downplay an issue. If it was an issue we didn't think was a problem, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about it. So I think that is a valid point.
Thank you.
Or yeah, well, yeah. Or at least couching it, whilst in percentage terms, this may seem insignificant. No, that's not the right word, but in reality, there's lots and lots and lots of real evidence from real communities about the impact it's having. So it's probably easy just to not put in information that could be seen to run counter to the points we're making elsewhere.
Can I just make a supplementary?
Yeah.
Can I just make a supplementary to that, Chair, as well? Although it may be 2% across the city, in Guildhall, it's a much higher percentage. And in Micklegate, it's a much higher percentage because that's where the properties are concentrated. Now, for those people that need to live in the city centre, and that's where we've got the highest levels of need, that overall percentage is way higher than 2%.
Okay, I'll carry on. You've got another point.
Just my second question, then I'll finish, Chair. Thank you. So I wanted to touch on the protective covenants point, paragraph 46. Sounds positive to me, but I wondered if there's any room for elaborating on that in the final submission to say whether developers are keen on it or if there's obstacles being put forward in that exploration of options. Just because it's another possible tool that can be used to help.
Want to come back on that?
Well, it's an encouragement rather than a capacity to mandate unless it's given some powers, some enforceability under the NPPF. As a partner within York Central, we can ask for some protections to those being not used for Airbnb. We would do that through using examples of other housing sites near to the city centre where the failure to do those covenants in the early days has led to a drop in value of the properties that remain to be sold because nobody wants to live next to 10 Airbnbs or 10 property holiday lets. The argument running counter to that has always been that if you make any restrictions on the covenant, you reduce the saleable value. We've now got evidence that that's not actually the case in the city centre. So we could encourage, but until it's got some kind of legislative power, we have no ability to enforce.
Do you want to come back on any of that, Michael?
Yeah. So I'm definitely not looking to defend what's in here, but just in terms of paragraph 16, it says 66% of business rates registered holiday lets are within 2 city centre wards and 84% are found across 5 city centre wards. So perhaps a sentence or two after that could emphasise the significance of that in terms of whilst it's 2% citywide, it's much more significant within a small number of wards which are feeling the biggest impacts. So I can add that in after that paragraph if that would be helpful.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Bassey.
Thank you, Chair. I want to take a slightly different slant on all of this. What really struck me looking through this was a need to understand the impact of these changes on council tax, on business rates, on revenues, on council services, and what those trends mean in the long term. So when I see that there's 1,100 home increase for short-term holiday lets, of which 433 have now registered for business rates rather than council tax. I'm concerned there that there's a huge potential for a significant loss in revenue to the city council. This city relies on tourism, and we've discussed on a number of different occasions, Chair, the possibilities of tourism taxes and things like that to make sure that this city survives and thrives with its tourists and can continue to provide good services. So I'd really love to hear from officers what that impact is on council revenue at the moment, what the trends suggest it might be, and how this whole business may be affecting council services going forwards?
Very good
I think it's a
question.
good question, but it's not one that the government want to know by tonight. So
Yes, but I'm worried always that they ask the questions they want to hear. We've had this week a consultation where people were asked, do they want to go back to imperial measurements or imperial measurements and metric, leaving a huge hole in the questions that might have been asked. And it seems to me that as in terms of scrutiny, it's an important question to us, surely, going forwards.
I think there's a whole set of questions that are embedded within that in terms of the statutory instruments that they use to classify and oversee this developing line of business. There's a real danger that if you take a simplistic approach to your policies on this, you just push the problem further down the line and might actually make it worse. So in terms of council income, if someone registers as a business and they're paying business rates on this, it's likely to be less than paying council tax. It's not going to necessarily pay for the community-based services that we have to provide to the same street. We have to collect bins, and if we don't have to collect one, then that's not a great deal of difference to the bin collection regime, but it is lost income. I think North Yorkshire have recently announced that they're going to double council tax holiday lets. There's a likelihood that that will push individuals into registering as a business, and therefore paying less, and that exacerbates the issue. So I don't think it can be taken in isolation. I'm not, however, the person to model council tax income and business rates revenue to be able to answer that question today, I'm afraid.
Michael?
Yeah, I was just going to say that perhaps question 8 could be an opportunity to say we potentially have concerns about the loss of council tax income in the long term, because it just talks about, do you consider the increase in short-term and holiday lettings in England to have any other adverse impacts on local communities and residents? So I could talk about concern about that, even if we can't really present any hard facts or information.
I think that would be a legitimate comment to make, even without a robust financial analysis or graph, because as you mentioned, Michael, the consultation system doesn't allow you to submit pictures, which is a shame. But
can I just follow up?
Yes,
Chair. So thank you for that suggestion, and yes, if it can be fed into one of those areas, that would be very good. We heard from the public speaker earlier, and we're hearing in this report a lot of reference to other cities in the UK and elsewhere. Do we have evidence of whether the measures they have taken have been in part driven by a desire to maintain council services as well as simply to regulate holiday lets?
anybody want to have a go?
The short answer, no, I don't have any evidence.
Right, okay.
Count-
Am I
sorry.
allowed to say that reading the article about North Yorkshire today, the quote from an officer was that it was to improve council income, and the quote from the executive member was, or somebody, an elected member, was that it was to help communities. So
Okay.
that's the answer to that question.
It-
So it's probably variable.
Yeah, well, I'll do some digging to try and find out exactly what they're doing and why. I've got Councillor Cobain with a supplementary, and then Councillor Fitzpatrick.
It's kind of just supplementary to question 8, seeing as how we're on it, because obviously question 8 gives us the opportunity to voice our opinions in terms of do you consider. I would like to see added to that short-term holiday lets, where they start to become predominant, undermine community cohesion and undermine communities doing gathering and doing things together. So for example, in some of the communities in Micklegate, we have lost people who have who've sold up either to people who are going to do holiday lets, or they've moved because the noise from living next door to a party house. And if the people who replace them are on holiday, they're clearly not going to get involved in any of your community projects that you've got going, you know, whether that's, you know, doing up the kids' play park or running your community garden. So actually, when I talk about hollowing out of communities in particularly in Micklegate and Guildhall, what it means is you've got less people who are active in the community simply because you've got less people who are living in the community on a permanent basis. So I would like to see something about that detrimental impact on communities included in the answer to question 8.
Yeah, and I think again, referring back to the public speaker, I think that would reflect and other contributions reflect the concerns that do exist about community, whether it's community cohesion or I can't really think of a better way of describing it, because it's a lack of engagement, involvement,
Community involvement as
Yeah.
well. Yeah, there's just less people there to get involved with the community.
Got a few more supplementary hands. Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Thank you. On question 8, as local councillor, if I can just make a couple of points, then ask a question. Totally agree with Councillor Kilbane there about community cohesion, and with the public speaker, in as much as in the Groves, in that area, we're very near the hospital. We're losing housing for essential workers because they're having to move further out of York. That means they're maybe leaving the hospital, going elsewhere. So it's having an impact in things like that, which really is not good. We are losing people to actually be involved in community type projects, Clarence Gardens, etc. People who would have been involved, nurses, as I say, people from the hospital, cut through Clarence Gardens. That was going to be a joint kind of project. That's not happening now because of things like that. I had a meeting this morning with businesses in the city and Make It York around the purple flag status that we have got, and hotels, for example, one in Micklegate, Middleton's, and certainly Galtres Lodge, places like that. They are very hard hit in terms of numbers for them by what's happening with housing as well. So they are businesses that are of concern. A question to Becky, really. It's been asked of me on a few occasions by some residents when they ask questions that relate to any of this, and they get answers back from the planning department that gives a kind of blanket, the law says or the law implies. Could that not be evidenced in a bit more detail as to where in law it is, what particular clause or statement or whatever, so that residents who might know or be interested to follow up the law there, could they not be able to look that up themselves then?
I don't think there is a blanket per se. I think that's the advice that officers give, is that we have to look at it on a case by case basis. Because of the use class order and the way it's framed, it's not as easy as it falls in one category or it falls in the other. We have to look and see on the individual evidence of the individual case of whether or not there has been a change of use. So yes, it is possible, but it all depends on the specific case that we're looking at. So this is the frustration from a planning point of view, because if holiday lets had their own use class, this wouldn't be an issue. It would be a change of use if you were going to use your property as a holiday let. That's not the case. So it's then having to look at where it falls. We have to use things like the council tax that we've spoke about, or evidence from neighbours about the impact on the community. It's taking all that into account. So there isn't a blanket, unfortunately. It is on a case by case basis what we have to look at, and look at the evidence around that and then consider it. And then if a planning permission is required, that's when we then look at the site specifics, as we would do with any planning application.
Thank you. You have a supplementary.
It's not supplementary, it's a different question altogether.
Well, I'll go to Councillor Hope first. He's been waiting patiently. Sorry, Tracy.
Can
did
I
you
just
want to-
catch what we've agreed so far before we move on to
Yes.
further ones? So on question 8, we're going to add in the impact on council tax income from premises switching over to paying business rates. We're going to add in a commentary on where we've got a predominance of holiday lets, the impact on community cohesion and participation, the hollowing out angle, and the impact on particularly near the hospital of the reduction in the available accommodation for essential key workers. And
probably worth mentioning, and hospitality staff as well.
And do you want us to add in the impact on small B&Bs and hotels of a switch away from that provision of?
I think that that's partly covered in the response to question 2, which which we can do that when we move on to question 2. But we may find as we go through, we've dealt with a lot of the issues anyway, which is fine. Okay, Councillor Hook.
Thank you, Chair. Just one thing, when you're quoting percentages, would it be worthwhile quoting the percentage of holiday lets compared with the number of new houses that we have to build each year, according to the local plan? Because I think that might be a big one, because that is also meaning that we're buying further out, we're taking up real remote sites, people have to travel further, it's less green. Because of that, you haven't got the public transport provision, all those sorts of things that we're experiencing well out in, beyond the ring road. I just think that's just a point that might be an interesting statistic.
I think it would be difficult to do it by ward, but as a total.
Well, no,
we
just as
can
a total
represent
for the city.
sum total
Because if the
compared to the
city's-
numbers that are provided for within the local plan.
Yeah, because if the city's got to buy, it could be quite a big percentage. So that's just one thing that's a side thing, because I was really surprised you only had 2 houses in rural West York, because we've got loads near us. There's one house that is trying to get permission to break down from 1 house to being 5 houses. It's 10 at the moment, because it hasn't got that permission officially yet. It's created for B&Bs, Airbnbs. So that's right in the heart of Poppleton. You've also at one of my villages parish councils the other day, they were saying they have enormous parking problems, and that's one issue that hasn't come out, because they're not part of the farming community that the village is. And so they don't appreciate that the people staying at this Airbnb don't appreciate that there's great big huge wide farm vehicles that need to get out, and they can't get out because of all the people from the Airbnb parking. And just generally in places where parking's short, suddenly one house that would normally have 1-2 cars could have umpteen thousand cars. So, that really is an issue in lots of places, I think, and probably more so in the centre even than out in rural West York. So that's all, but I know that we have a lot out in, and it's upping the house prices, because one thing that's happening in rural West York is a bungalow somewhere comes up for sale because someone's died or something. The investors, the developers have got the money to buy it. They then promptly knock it down and build an Airbnb with an ensuite bathroom in every bedroom. So it's pretty obvious it's going to be a B&B.
Can I capture those comments then?
Yeah.
There's one to add about the likelihood of the underrepresentation of the numbers based on that as an example.
I think particularly in paragraph 14, where we refer to air DNA mapping, showing a concentration closer to centre, which, I suppose just to kind of caveating that, saying, but we are, aware that there's, as well as an under-reporting in the centre, as Councillor Hook said, in some of the outlying villages, it may well be that there is a market for the visitor who wants to stay in the village with all of the village pub and the village green, hop on a bus and enjoy the centre of York and then go back to the village. So there's that dynamic which I certainly hadn't appreciated.
And there's the parking question, which needs to be captured in the question about the impacts on communities. That another question 8 one.
Yeah. Okay. Councillor Pavlovic.
Thanks, Chair. Are we, sorry, can I just clarify? We're not just focusing on question 1 here, we're looking at all of the questions in their entirety.
If we can draw a line under question 1 now and move on to question 2, we may find as we go through, we've already answered some of the other questions, but if we can try and move through.
Right, I've just got some general comments on statements within the various
consultation questions. And
Whilst it's in your mind, I'll let you go ahead.
you always indulge me. Thank you. So in question 2, you state in paragraph 23, we do not have insight into the relative economic benefits of a consumer choosing a short-term holiday let versus a bed and breakfast or hotel. Well, we actually do. I mean, you know, Make It York, Councillor Fitzpatrick's just talked to you about hotels and guest houses. We've seen in the media guest houses closing because of the impact of Airbnb. We know that guest houses, small B&Bs and hotels have a different regulatory framework that they have to abide by. And you do make mention to that in paragraph 25. But I think we've got more than we do not have insight. I think we've got quite a lot of anecdotal insight that this is an issue. I've got some other bits as well.
Yeah.
Shall I do them all?
Well, if just pause on that one. I mean,
Okay.
I know we are constrained by the way in which the questions are being worded. You know, what are the benefits? What are the main benefits? I suppose that doesn't preclude us from saying that there are
Well,
also
the question is, what do you consider to be the main benefits for businesses and the wider economy? Well, yeah, on the one hand, yes, there is a benefit to shops and the tourism industry. On the other hand, there's a disbenefit. Is that a word? If there's such a word as a disbenefit, there is potentially a disbenefit for local, long-established small hotels and guest houses and B&Bs.
Yes, and I guess the key word in that sentence is relative, because I guess what we don't know is the benefits that come from Airbnbs in terms of the businesses that benefit from the growth of Airbnbs in the city. So yes, we know it has a negative impact on some established B&Bs, but we don't know what the benefit of the Airbnbs is on the local economy is, I guess, what that sentence is trying to say. But if that doesn't come across.
So clearly, yes, this benefits the local economy because you've got more tourists coming in, notwithstanding where they're staying. But the negative impacts are potentially on those businesses, those established businesses that have to comply with a regulatory framework that short-term lets don't.
Yeah, so the point I made about as capturing the impact on existing small businesses for B&Bs and hotels in question, I think if we put that in 1 and do that as a disbenefit to the benefit question, it balances that one out better than putting it in 8.
Yeah. Okay, carry on.
In 6, do you consider the increase in short-term holiday lets to have had an adverse consequences on the housing market? Well, I think you've heard from a number of speakers around the table that we feel that there's a significant one, and particularly in certain wards, and that includes some of the rural wards, to say that we therefore conclude that at present there's a minor problem. And though you do say we conclude that at present there's a minor problem at present, so I take one of the at presents. But even then, I think the conclusion that you've come to is not necessarily the one that I would agree with. I'm not convinced that it's something that anybody around the table would agree with. We feel it's a significant issue at the moment, particularly in certain wards, and unless action is taken, it will become an out of control problem. And that's when I want to come on to what happened in London as an example of if we don't regulate now, it's too late, say, recording for evidence of the problem. Once we've gone past the tipping point, change the nature of York entirely. Sorry, I didn't have my mic on for any of that. So anybody that was watching that didn't hear any of the points I've just made.
So can I suggest that we just reframe our answer to that question? So it starts with average house prices in York are already a problem. We know that holiday lets is likely to be one of the factors in the increase in costs of those houses, but we can't break that out. However, anecdotally, it is increasingly becoming a factor in decision making around house within to dispose and the house value that accrues from it, and that it therefore needs regulation at this point before it exacerbates.
Yeah, I think we sort of, don't need to be constrained by having to use minor or major. I think we can get the point across we want to get across about the significance of the issue without getting trapped in some of the government speak.
Yeah.
So are you happy?
I mean, one community's minor is another community's really significant. And I think we should be not making blanket statements of saying overall it's minor, because I feel that it's more significant than that. And then on 12, you've put not applicable, and I appreciate what has been the impact of the Deregulation Act 2015, specifically changes made by Section 44 to the Greater London Council, General Powers Act 1973, and you put not applicable. But what we saw in London is that prior to 2015, short-term lets had to have a change of use. They deregulated that, and what we saw within the next 3 years, I think, was a 400% increase in short-term lets. Now, if that is an example of what happens when there is no regulation, we can see, you can extrapolate it forward, that the situation in York is only going to get more and more and more significant. And that leads into the point I made previously, which nobody heard apart from those around the table, about once you've gone beyond a tipping point, it's too late to try to backtrack and do something about it now.
So just something, was that a proposal that we do say something?
Well,
under that?
I do. Yeah, I do feel that you can use the example of what happened in London as a concern for what we are going to see moving further down the line in cities like York and many other areas of the country. You know, it's not a York specific issue. This is an issue for many places around the country, and that's why I think politicians, national politicians of all parties from all around the country, are so concerned about this issue.
But we can't use the graphs that are in paras 9 and 10 because they can't fit them into the form, but they kind of underline how the problem in York is becoming more acute compared to some of our non-London comparators. So maybe we can use.
Can you write that into? Can you write that in text rather than do it as a map?
Yeah.
Okay. Councillor Cobain.
Just supplementary to that, then, if we're going to be doing that, then it would make sense on para 36 just to take out the sentence, there's no empirical data that short-term holiday lets affected the housing market, because I think that just weakens our cases, but especially if we're putting something in to say that, you know, the affordability ratio in York is way off the scale, and we can show examples of houses that would only be bought for the short-term holiday let market. We need to strengthen our case, really. You can take that out. And just as a point of clarity, what does, on question 9.6, what is the regulatory alternative to registration schemes such as an extension of deregulation? What does that mean?
Question 9.6.
Question 9.
9.6, what does that mean in sort of language that we'd understand?
Anyone want to hazard a guess? I suppose it's kind of suggesting something other than something under an act, but I mean, yeah.
I think I know the answer.
Councillor Pavlovic thinks he knows the answer.
I think what they're saying is they're seriously considering registration, If, however, there was an alternative to registration, such as the deregulation that London saw, would that be something that you would support? And I think the answer to that is a pretty big no.
Sorry, Chair, can I just, because that doesn't really make sense, does it? Because as you go 1 to 6, you get tougher and tougher the actions. What we're saying that 6 is just let the market decide. Is that what we're saying? I just hoping we're not missing a trick.
No, I think looking at the response, we're not saying we think option 6 is good. Yeah, so we're saying policy responses should be considered around option 5 and additionally through the planning use classes order. So I think we're on the right tracks. Councillor Hook.
What about covenants? If they could be enforced as well? Like was talked about for York Central, if you could put that in the leases and say you must not do holiday lets and make it enforceable.
It's tricky because that kind of sits
England's
outside.
planning laws date back to the Romans. I think that the difficulty of making a statutory instrument that can apply across planning law will be fraught with difficulty. I'm no lawyer, but I think that would be almost impossible.
Okay, right. Councillors, we have a quick canter through the other questions to pick up any issues or points the members may have identified in advance that we haven't flushed out in that helpful and wide-ranging discussion. So question 2, the only thing I wrote down that sprung to mind, which Councillor Fitzpatrick mentioned, was impact on hospitality, and I would hope that the Hospitality Association, either in York or nationwide, is aware of this call for evidence and will actually be submitting comments, but that's obviously something that's beyond our control in terms of the impact on ability to recruit staff. But is there anything else under question 2 that anyone thinks we need to tweak at all? Nope. In which case, question 3, which was this rather bizarre concept of level of compliance against regulations that don't apply to short-term holiday lets at this point in time. I suppose it would have been, we couldn't really say, what a silly question. Please see answers to following questions. But you've worded it very politely, pointing out that these are not currently required on short-term holiday lets. Does anyone else have anything else they would want to say other than point that out, which we already do? No? Okay. Question 4. Do we consider there to be a problem with breach of contractual agreements in the short-term and holiday letting market?
Just bearing in mind that this same questionnaire is being answered by very different sectors, so I'm assuming that financial services industry will responding on this one themselves.
Okay. Question 5. Anything under that? I thought the final sentence in our paragraph 30 in response to question 5 was kind of in a nutshell, really, and described quite well the situation that pertains in York. Is there anything else anybody would want to say or add to that? No? Okay. Question 6, impact on the housing market, which we've just discussed the final section of paragraph 32 and how we would like to see that reworded in a way that doesn't inadvertently downplay the problem that I think we're agreed does exist.
Paragraph 31, the last thing.
Paragraph 31.
not causing.
Thank you. So the final sentence of paragraph 31 currently reads, numbers of entire homes, short-term holiday lets represents a relatively small percentage of the total properties available in the city. Therefore, it is reasonable to assume that at a city level, it is not causing a major problem in the housing market, but maybe having a greater impact at more micro level. Is there a way of slightly rewording that? Again, in line with what we've articulated for the end of paragraph 32. Councillor Hook.
The costs that tend to be the most material are the marginal costs. So when we look at prices in the village, it's always, what did it last go for? And that is set by the developer, and then it goes higher and higher. So that a bungalow, you know, just a little bungalow will go for 325 in January. It's now going for 370. And it's because the developers, and it's moving up and up because the last person who bought, that's now the price. And so it goes up. So it's the marginal cost that matters more than average.
So, okay, Michael. So, thank you. Question 7, sort of focus on antisocial behaviour and other nuisance behaviour. Anyone have any comments on what we're saying here? Nope. Okay. Question 8. Other adverse impacts on local communities, which we've discussed, and we agreed a form of word. Sorry, Councillor.
If we can just go back to, to 7 again.
Yep.
I don't think we need to point out that the number of cases so far reported is relatively low. So, you know, if you live on particular streets and you're getting it all the time, you know, it is dependent upon where you're living, isn't it? So, you know, it might be low over the whole city, but certain parts of the Groves and certain parts of Micklegate, it's happening to people all the time. So I'm cautious of us downplaying the problem. So it might be worth taking that sentence out. Yeah.
Or saying, you know, the number of cases reported is increasing and the negative impacts. Because that's factually correct. Okay. Question 8 we discussed in terms of making reference to other impacts on community cohesion and other sort of community amenity issues, really, parking, etc. And question 9, where we have this multiple choice arrangement, and we conclude at paragraph 41 by saying policy responses should be considered around option 5 and additionally through the planning and use classes order, which is it's like a mission in the list of options that the government have given us to choose from, but it's helpful that that point is made. Anyone else have any comments or concerns about the response to that? Okay. Question 10, costs and associated burdens of these options. Response there talks about costs being covered by a fee for whatever regulatory process is put in place, which is similar to what exists currently for other scenarios. Tracy?
Yeah, just to add a bit more detail, we might just refer back to the licensing cost mechanisms for HMOs.
Okay, as a sort of comparator. Yeah, that'd be helpful. Question 11, so insight into the impact schemes running elsewhere. So there's reference there to London, Edinburgh, Wales, and France, and Brighton. Anyone have any other national or international examples to throw into the mix? Councillor Hook.
Sorry, can I go back to 10? Because our public speaker did mention that they were recouping the costs of enforcement because there were such big fines.
Was this in France? Yes. Okay.
Sorry, that's not the same in England.
No.
We didn't work this through. But that's not part of the planning enforcement process, so we can't introduce something just for that.
It could be part of a regulation, a licensing process,
Yes,
though.
but
Yeah.
not through
It
planning.
was, a regulatory framework that had powers to issue punitive fines. And
So that could be part of question 11, actually.
so yeah, we could mention in question 11, we are aware that, the jurisdictions, powers exist to levy sort of punitive fines that may act as a disincentive for, breach of regulatory requirements. Question 12, we've talked about. Question 13, any other information that you wish to draw to the government's attention? Is there anything else not covered elsewhere? Councillor Pavlovic.
So just to sort of sum up and summarise, within the public speaker mentioned within the local plan, H5 of the Cambridge plan, about the loss of overall amenity, and that was factored in to Cambridge's local plan, where obviously in the local plan process. And I have had a conversation with Becky about this, so I am going to put you on the spot here. Is locally, without waiting for any regulatory framework or legislation to come in, what powers do you think the local authority in York could impose to try to at least address the issue of the rise of Airbnbs? I mean, you talked about supplementary planning documents and other things within the local plan. So it'd be just interesting if you could explore that just a little bit, in case you do want to write that into this.
Yeah, in the short term, there isn't an easy fix. There just isn't, unless the government changes the youth classes order, which would be the ultimate goal, in my opinion, that they changed. In the short term, I don't think there is, because the local plan's at a point where it's so far progressed that we can't start adding new policies in there. So it's what we would then do once, hopefully, it gets adopted, and then we then look at the evidence base that we've got through this and through working with colleagues of whether or not there is a need at that point to look at a supplementary planning guidance or something along those lines. But there isn't an immediate fix, is the answer. We can look at obviously how our enforcement teams respond. We definitely have had an increase in the number of enforcement complaints. You can see that through the evidence that we've got. We have now got a full team that are on and working on this. We potentially can look at our enforcement priorities, potentially, whether or not that's something that we look at in the short term. But ultimately, we need something from the government that gives us a youth class order book, basically.
Can I suggest, and I can feel Michael looking daggers at me now.
Oh, that Michael, not me.
No, that one. That we're just using the opportunity in that question just to draw it back to, if you give us the youth class orders, there's something we can do about it. And until you do that, we've got our hands tied behind our backs.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful. But can I just go back to Becky's points about the local plan being where it is currently, but post adoption, you feel that there is something that could be done with a supplementary planning document. Or, I mean, what you're talking about is conceivable post adoption.
Potentially, but yes, potentially, depending on the evidence base. I don't like to promise you things
No,
that
no.
I don't know that can actually happen.
No.
But yes, we can look at that depending on the evidence that we have that shows a loss of housing, or the basis for it would need to be sound before we could do an SPD. And exactly how that would work, I couldn't tell you, but yes, we can look at it depending on the evidence base at that point. But I'm not going to promise you anything in here now. We can look at it, but I'm not going to say that
And
it
it,
definitely
and
happen.
it's, yeah, probably not something we'd mention here, but it's a valid point. Councillor Vassie?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I've just been trying to make sense of the point that was raised earlier by Councillor Kilbane, because it puzzled me too, this regulatory alternative to registration. So I've just been looking it up on the government website. And what they say is, under that section, for example, by creating a similar framework to that established by Section 44 of the Deregulation Act 2015 and applying to all local authorities in England. Currently, this framework only applies to Greater London. And elsewhere, they then point out that what that means in London is that there's a cap of 90 days per annum for letting out a property on a short-term basis. And presumably you could then compute from that that would have an impact further back on the business of short-term rentals that advertise, that switch from council tax to business rates, because the report says here that you're only able to do that if you're letting your property out for 140 days or more.
That's why I was wrong. So it's quite the opposite to what I said.
Just to put that in context, that's what I appear to be seeing.
Okay.
Well done.
Does anyone else have anything else to say before we let Michael go away and try and burn the midnight oil, updating the draft response?
Who's drawn the short straw? Oh, sorry, Michael.
Michael, you,
Well, thank you, officers, for coming and sharing the draft response with us. I'm sorry that the timing of this meeting and the consultation meant that it really is last minute, but I thought it was a discussion worth having and worth having in public as well. So thank you. At this point, members of the Economy and Place Committee are free to leave, but you're welcome to stay if you really want to, but entirely up to you.
Finance plan.
Councillor Craghill.
Before everybody leaves, I just wanted to ask you, as executive member, this has been really useful and very helpful, I think. I just wanted to ask if as a committee you wanted, obviously all this has been focused on what we submit to consultation and Michael can get on with it. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts about wanting to pick up any other elements of what we can do without a change in legislation, whether they're only smaller things like we've referred to now, like improving the sort of coordination between different enforcement parts of the council, or improving the access for residents to information, you know, so we have a one page on the website, those sort of things. I just, you know, you don't have to do it now. You may just want to think about, you know, if you have any other things you want to feed in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, we can add it to the list of kind of work plan items and see how we might pick up on it. But again, I think something that is kind of led by kind of residents, in terms of, well, residents telling us, well, what would they find useful in terms of whether it's about enforcement, whether it's about kind of access to information, so that communities feel a bit more empowered, but still not necessarily as in control as they would want to be. Yeah, that'd be helpful. Councillor Kilbane.
And just on that point, it's very, very helpful. Councillor Craghill, the resident was very clear that what it takes is resources, and what it takes is financing the team to enforce it, you know, making sure that they've got enough people to be able to do the job all the time. And, you know, that's a political decision in terms of allocation of resources. And clearly, you know, there might be some seasonality to this work as well. But we need to, you know, if we're gonna do what we can do, then we need the people in situ to respond as and when it's happening, so that they can gather the evidence and take appropriate action against the landlords.
Councillor Vassie, then Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Chair. So I was going to say, just given the conversation we had earlier, I think it would be useful for the council going forward to assemble the data that we weren't able to lay our hands on, and I understand why. It's cross-departmental stuff, but I think it would be helpful going forward
We
to
couldn't
actually
assemble it because
understand
it
those.
doesn't exist, nor do we have the resources to be able to mine that particular
Yeah.
channel. I think the point that I do want you to just go back to is that without some changes to statute and regulation around it, we are unable to significantly change the situation. That's why this push is most important. There may be information we can provide in a better way for residents who are struggling with this, but that I think that's going to be very, very limited in scope.
Yeah, and I think I take your point in terms of there's a lot of anecdotal information. Councillor Hook talking about situation in her community, and I'm sure every councillor would have similar information to throw into the pot. But that's information you don't have at your fingertips because it hasn't been collected in that way. So I think there's more that can be done. Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Yeah, just to add to that, really, I think residents are suggesting, as the question I asked Becky, that they want to demystify the kind of answers they get, really, and the explanations, really, if they can be simplified in a way that they can understand, because it sometimes feels to them, they're telling me as ward councillor, that they, you know, hiding behind language and terminology that they don't necessarily understand, really, when they're getting answers. So if that's one thing. But in other respects, I do think it's about enforcement, and I know it's about resources, but really the concerns that I'm getting, and I know Councillor Crankhill will agree with me, in the Guildhall ward, the number of issues that are coming up that require enforcement, really, and we just haven't got the enforcement officers there. So that is something that I think, you know, the administration need to look at.
And as housing and community safety, it's something that's within our remit to have a look at, so we can do. Councillor Hook.
Just one final thing, in order to quantify it, would it be possible to do something through the electoral roll? Even a question like there are no residents because it's a holiday let, it's because they're not British citizens, blah, blah, blah. Just something like that would then get us the answer. Because I know in my ward which are the holiday things, because they're not on the electoral roll. Mostly.
An interesting point. Thank
Not
you.
the only people aren't on the
No.
electoral roll, so it's not.
Yeah, but-
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Yes, we'll have a 5-minute break if anyone needs a comfort break. That's okay. We'll just have a pause. Thank you. Everybody, let's restart. So we've got agenda item 4, which is the Q1 finance and performance monitor. So if I can ask Patrick, first of all, welcome. If you can introduce this item, please.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, Patrick Looker, Head of Service Finance across the Council. So this report's your usual quarterly update to Scrutiny. It covers Q1 of 22-23. The information was reported back to the Executive 18th of August 2022. Worth pointing out that the information, the data was calculated up to the end of June, so there's still a lot of uncertainty at the end of June, and I will highlight a couple of other areas as we go along. Across General Fund, we identified additional utility bills at the General Fund hostels and showing a £90,000 pressure. Hot off the press, the government have announced a relaxation on some of the price costs that businesses will pick up, so that cost is likely to reduce the projection later in the year. But we haven't got the actual figures for what that's like to be just yet. We are working on the assumption that the remainder of the Housing General Fund will come in on budget. And again, it's very important that we do bring those on budget. It was identified at the Executive back in August that there are a number of pressures across the rest of the Council. So it's important that services in this particular area do come in on budget where possible. Within the HRA, at the time of writing the report, we're forecasting that the account will be on balance. We have had some issues around Glen Lodge. There's been a number of, we've had to close a number of the rooms at Glen Lodge, so income is down in that particular area. However, there are offsetting savings across vacancies in general management and slight reduction in the revenue contribution to capital, which meant that we anticipated at that time that the budget will be on target. I think it's important to raise or to highlight a couple of pressures that aren't included in here. So general repairs, we are aware that both our own internal staff are costing more due to the anticipated pay award. We know materials are increasing in cost quite significantly, as are the cost of subcontractors. So all those rates are increasing at higher than what we've put in the budget. There's a challenge there for the service to manage the general repairs within the budget, but that's something which we're keeping a close eye on. The other one to obviously mention is the utility prices across the HRA, which haven't been calculated at the time of this report. We'll be updating that to members, the update in Q2. It will be a 6-figure sum in terms of the impact on the HRA. We've got our own hostels. We also pick up the cost of sheltered, the utility costs in sheltered housing. So the number is quite a significant increase. So that's something which we've got to keep an eye on across the HRA. Again, not quite as bad as I haven't told you yet that it is going to be, but it's still quite a significant figure. I think the HRA is in a reasonable position, but it can cope with one-off hits. Where it's going to be a difficulty is if the increasing costs are ongoing. We've got a consultation from the government in terms of limiting potentially what rents can go up next financial year, which, whilst that's helpful in terms of cost of living for a number of tenants, it also saves the government quite a significant benefits bill, which they're expecting the local authority and the other residents to effectively subsidise. So we've got to keep a close eye on how that consultation and what impact that's got on the viability of the HRA going forward and what impact that might have in reductions that we'll have to take forward. In terms of performance, you've got the usual tables. I'd normally say that Ben and Michael will help, but Tracy's here, so I'm sure she'll answer what she can answer where there are specific questions from members. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. Do members have any questions on any components of the report? I'll start with one, paragraph 24. It's probably one for Tracy, in terms of turnaround time for empty properties. I know there's some context about the challenges that have led to the current turnaround times and a suggestion that should improve. I just wondered whether that is that being kind of borne out from what you're seeing in the current quarter.
Yeah, there's two aspects to this. There's the there's two properties or two different projects where we have strategically decided that we are updating and upgrading a number of properties in a larger scale capital scheme. Those are still counting as voids, and those projects are ongoing, but they're not going to be quick. So we're unlikely to see a quick turnaround on those. The rest of the voids turnarounds, we have got a specific program now. We've got a dedicated managerial resource in place to oversee the voids process, which, if you think about what it's doing, it sits at the kind of interface point between allocations and lettings and building services where there's works to be done. We've got someone overseeing that interface to make sure that we're not dropping the ball in between those two, and that we are identifying kind of quick wins to progress that and managing the resource really tightly around it. That has already, in the figures that you see here, seen an improvement in performance, and that is continuing. It's not as kind of immediate as I'd like it to be, because of that kind of rump of strategic voids that we've got, but it's definitely bearing fruit, and we've got further service improvements in the last 4 weeks, which kind of mirror this trajectory of improvement.
Thank you. Councillor Pomerick.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Patrick, for this report. I've got a few questions, really. The snapshot about the number of homeless households with dependent children in temporary accommodation, that's increased, although it's smaller than quarter one. When you say temporary accommodation, what type of temporary accommodation are you talking about? Are you talking about James House, for example, or are you talking about bed and breakfast?
It covers both of those types, but I'd
So
probably,
can I ask you, how many have we got in bed and breakfast?
it covers, I don't know.
You don't know?
This figure covers all of the temporary accommodations, as far as I understand it. But the trajectory of it being bad and going up, that doesn't appear to be borne out by any of the statistics that we've just looked at on the BI portal. It's down as being 27 now, 31 in the previous quarter. Last year it was the general pattern is 28, 29. And then in 2021, when everybody was not allowed out on the street, it went down to 10. So I think it may look bad compared to COVID year, which wasn't representative. It seems to be relatively steady apart from that. So I'd probably say it's a no change trajectory.
Would it be possible, because we do have it says the quarter 4 data is available in August. I mean, I don't suppose you have that just off the top of your head, do you? No. And secondly, just on that topic, would you be able to distribute to members of this committee how many people we've actually got in bed and breakfast? Is that okay? Thank you. Just one other question I've got for Patrick. Paragraph 13, the HRA working balance to start repaying the debt that it incurred as part of self-financing in 2012. Do we pay interest on that 121 million pounds that was transferred over to us, whether we liked it or not?
Absolutely, we're paying interest on 121 million. Yeah, we had to take loans out to the value of 121 million pounds in 2012, and so we got a slightly enhanced rate that the government offered through PWLB at that time, but it was still at around 3.5%. So we're paying over £4 million of interest over, which was effectively to get that level of income that we were making prior to, that we were repaying to government back in 2012. Obviously, lots of things have changed since then. There were cuts in rents that we've had to make for 3-4 years. And there's been other investments going on. So effectively, a lot of that balance that we were getting back in 2012 is no longer there. So we're now paying interest and not really getting, and it's not really providing us a significant investment into the HRA now. So that's again something that we need to consider going forward.
Thank you. I
Yeah.
think that's me covered.
Okay.
To be honest, I think that's me covered. I mean, there were questions about repairs. These programs these two programs that you're talking about of major, more significant works that are still being classed as voids. Is this because people have been decanted out of their homes whilst you're doing this work? And right.
It's the two schemes that were reported to last executive or one before. So it's the Bell Farm pods and the older part of Glen Lodge.
Right.
And residents have been decanted out of those, ready for significant amounts of work to be done to address health and safety issues, either through water management in Glen Lodge or through asbestos and damp in the Bell Farm pods.
So is that the flooding? Is that the groundwater flooding issue in Bell Farm?
No, it's they've got asbestos additional pods tacked onto the back of the existing structure,
Right.
which are failing and leading to potential risk to exposure to asbestos, but also it's the kind of bathroom units, so they are particularly unpleasant, in a very bad state, and all the tenants have been moved out of those until the works is done to replace those add-on structures with a more effective building solution.
So can I just ask a final question on that? So is that major work being done by subcontractors, and is there a knock-on impact on general repair times? You know, a lot of our contractors, employed contractors, pulled off their work to be doing that, which means that other repairs are getting delayed.
No, it's a separate procurement because it's
Right.
not covered by our existing contractors, so it'll be a separate procurement, so it won't impact upon that.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Councillor Bassey.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I want to very much welcome the information on paragraph 27 on the number of new affordable homes delivered in York. That's obviously hugely to be welcomed in this city. The next thing that struck me when I was reading all of this was that we've been talking about this for several years, haven't we? About and certainly over the past 12 months, the shortage of skilled tradespeople. And I note that progress is being made. But I found myself wondering when I was reading this, since we've also all been given papers on devolution, whether we might usefully recommend to the executive that focus is put on ensuring that training of skilled tradespeople forms a key part of the devolution settlement going forwards. Because it's about the challenges for council homes, but it's also very much about retrofit. There's a kind of paltry sum of 7 million, I think, given to the entire region for 30 years to transform the energy efficiency of homes, that we will all understand to be a risible quantity. But the whole thing starts with having skilled tradespeople. And I was just wondering, Chair, if, you know, as we're looking through this again and looking through these statistics again that show us the familiar pattern of the challenge that the council faces, whether we might just use this report as a way of just highlighting to the executive the importance we attach to training in the trades as solving a series of key problems and linking it to devolution and jobs and to creating jobs, as you say.
I'd be quite happy with that. And I know that, well, as you mentioned, part of the devolution minded to deal has adult skills and training as part of that.
Yeah.
I can't remember how much money was pinned to that, but I suppose it's the devolution of that responsibility, which may open up other opportunities, even if that pot of money won't get us very far. So I can't imagine anyone being horrified by that. But as I say, there are processes to go through before that proposed devolution deal
Yes.
moves on to further stages. So we probably don't get ahead of ourselves just yet. But no, it's a good point to make, and we can.
Is there a way of just formulating?
Yeah, we can minute that, and then it can be communicated. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments on the Q1 monitor? If not, thank you very much, Patrick and Tracy. Oh, sorry, Councillor Cuthbert. Did see that.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the report, Patrick, and for your comments, Tracy. I'm just curious to know how predictable any increase in domestic gas and perhaps electricity prices is going to be, given that this weekend we hear that gas prices reduced by 50%. It just seems, what do we know about the market that we're at the mercy of, if I can put it that way, in predicting what the likely extra expenditure is going to be for us on in these two areas?
Who'd like to have a go at that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Councillor Cuthbertson. It's the most volatile time we've seen in the energy market. We procure our energy currently through the YPO framework with a number of other councils, particularly in the northern area. Our contracts are 1 year fixed prices or fixed rates. There was the increase in electricity was over 120% on the 1st of April. In gas, it was over 400%. And that was based on what YPO could get on the market at the time that they go out. Those increases have been mitigated from the announcement that were made today, but that's only from October through till March. We don't know what the position is going to be from March. All local councils are in, and businesses and residents are in a similar position. And so there's a lot of uncertainty, which is why the government, I would imagine, is putting quite significant sums of money into mitigating the cost at this particular point in time. But all these measures are relatively short term, and the full costs aren't ultimately known.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Holly.
Thank
you. Just as a supplementary to that, are we seeing any knock-on impact on the rents coming in and enforcement action being taken over non-payment? Because of the cost of living, people basically can't afford to pay their rent.
Rent arrears are rising. You'll see the trends within this, and they continue to rise. It was quite difficult to actually spot the difference between rent arrears rising during COVID, well, during Brexit, then COVID, and then the cost of living crisis. But there has been an upward trajectory. Recovery activities, of course, during COVID were suspended, so we had a blip from that as well. And we're now looking at what we need to do to focus on recovery activities to restore that position, because our inability to recover rent affects our ability to spend on kind of core services. So it's quite important that we keep on top of that as much as possible. But people, we all know that we'll be impacted in it, and our tenants are too. So it's going to be, I think, difficult to bear down on that debt in a meaningful way, whilst there are such unprecedented rises in utilities costs.
And have we heard anything about what councils are expected to be doing regarding rent increases? I mean, obviously it can't be inflation +1. So have the government given you any indication what they're expecting councils to levy, and are they offering any support to councils to mitigate the loss of income?
Well, there's currently a consultation that's being undertaken by DLUC, and their 3 options are, I think, 3%, 5%, 7%, with their preferred cap at 5%. Obviously, there is an option that if it was CPI plus 1%, you'd be looking at 11, 12% increases in rent. But what I think it's also important to note is that the costs of the HRA are going up significantly more than 5%. So if we only get 5% increase in rent, that's going to put an impact on the repairs that we can do, the management that we can do, the support that we can provide. There is no indication within the consultation that the government are prepared to support the social housing sector, but this, as I say, it's only a consultation at the moment, so we require some further detail on that.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you, Patrick and Tracy, for that. Agenda item 6, which is the work plan, as set out there. We're likely to have an additional meeting in October to cover items 2 and 3 that were deferred from this meeting's agenda. 11th of October, but unless we're bumped by another meeting that has to be rearranged from some other time, then 11th of October is the date that's been penciled in. And then we have another public meeting in December. But also Vice Chair and I will keep an eye on that and see if there are any other urgent issues pop up in the meantime that we think we need to pick up. But there being no urgent business, thank you very much for your attendance and contributions this evening, and wish you good night.